In the early hours of June 7, 1992, 3 women vanished from one small home in Springfield, Missouri: 19-year-old Suzie Streeter, 18-year-old Stacy McCall, and Suzie's mother, Sherrill Levitt. Their cars were still in the driveway, their purses and keys were still inside, and there was no forced entry, no obvious struggle, just a broken porch light globe that got cleaned up before anyone understood it might matter. Tonight, we're uncovering the Springfield 3, the missing hours, the erased clues, and how 3 people can disappear from a house without leaving a clear reason behind. Quick question, do you think this was a fake authority trick, or someone they trusted? Comment one word: authority or trust. That Saturday night had been a celebration. Suzie and Stacy had just graduated. They spent the evening moving between parties, laughing, taking photos, doing the normal teenage thing where tomorrow feels guaranteed. Early Sunday morning, after the last party thinned out, their original plan changed. Instead of staying at a friend's house, they drove to Suzie's home on East Delmar Street. It was close, it was familiar, and it felt safe. That detail matters because they didn't disappear on a highway or at a gas station. They made it all the way home. They parked, they went inside, and then the world lost them after the door closed. Inside the home was Sherrill Levitt, Suzie's mother. She was an adult with a routine, a person who should have been impossible to just vanish, and yet she vanished the same way the girls did, cleanly, silently, without leaving a scene behind. By morning, people expected the girls to answer calls and show up for plans, but the phone kept ringing with no real response. At first, it felt like teenage oversleeping. Then it started to feel like something colder. Friends drove over to the house, and what they saw should have been comforting but wasn't. Both cars were there in the driveway, which meant the girls had arrived, and whatever happened, happened after that. The front door was unlocked, the inside looked mostly normal, and the family dog was still there, alive and waiting, like the house itself was still in mourning mode, even though the people were missing. Outside, the porch light globe was broken, glass scattered where you'd expect a small accident, but in a case with almost no physical clues, that broken glass becomes enormous because it might be the only sign of force, panic, or a struggle that never fully happened. The problem is, before anyone understood that, people cleaned it up, they swept glass away, they straightened the porch, they did what helpful friends do when something feels off. And in doing that, they may have erased fingerprints, shoe impressions, and direction. And the contamination didn't stop at the porch. People walked through rooms, touched doorknobs, picked up objects, answered the phone, moved items around, not because they were careless, but because they were desperate to find anything that explained the silence. One of the most painful details is the answering machine, because at some point there were messages, and one message in particular was believed to matter, but it was accidentally erased before police could preserve it. Think about that for a second. In a case this quiet, a few seconds of audio could have been everything: a voice, a threat, a prank, a wrong number that suddenly isn't a wrong number anymore. And then it was gone. So when law enforcement arrived, they didn't walk into a clean crime scene. They walked into a house that had already been handled by people who cared, and that meant the case immediately lost what it needed most: the tiny evidence you only get in the first hours. Investigators were left with a terrifying picture. 3 women vanish from a house, no forced entry, no obvious struggle, valuables and personal items left behind, and a door that suggests either trust, deception, or sudden control. Because if it was a stranger forcing their way in, you expect noise, you expect damage, you expect someone running, and if it was someone they knew, you expect at least one clue that points at a familiar pattern, but the house gave neither. That's why many people focus on the idea of authority, because authority makes people comply without a fight. A knock at the door from someone claiming to be police, security, a neighbor with an emergency. It can move 3 people out of a home without turning it into a battlefield. And the purses and keys being left behind fit that, because if you think you're stepping outside for 1 minute, you don't gather your life, you don't grab cash, you don't pack clothes, you just go. In the first days, tips started pouring in. Every case like this becomes a magnet for sightings. People report a van, a scream, a suspicious car, and each tip feels like it could be the one that breaks the story open. But sightings are a cruel kind of evidence because they multiply faster than they can be confirmed, and they can drag an investigation in 10 directions at once, especially when the true trail is already faint. The investigation also had to face a hard truth early. If 3 women are taken with no noise and no trace, the person doing it likely planned for control and planned for silence. That doesn't automatically mean a mastermind. It can mean someone familiar with intimidation, someone used to getting compliance, someone who knows how to keep victims moving, because once people are moved, the home stops being the scene. The home becomes the starting line, not the ending. Over the years, different suspects and persons of interest surfaced. Some were local criminals, some were opportunists, some were people with histories that made investigators take them seriously. But the case never delivered the one thing that turned suspicion into a conclusion. No confirmed location, no confirmed vehicle, no confirmed witness who could place the women in a specific place with a specific person. And without that, every suspect remains a shadow. One name that often comes up is a convicted kidnapper who later made claims about the case, and those kinds of claims hit like a hammer because families hear them and think, maybe this is finally the truth. But claims without recoveries become another kind of torment because they can't be tested in public, they can't be weighed against a body or a scene, and they keep the story alive without bringing it home. Then there's the theory that became almost infamous, the idea that the women were buried beneath a later construction site, a place that turned into concrete and weight, a theory that feels horrifying because it implies the answer has been sitting under people's feet for decades. Some searches and scans were done in areas tied to that rumor, and every time technology suggested an anomaly, hope flared, because hope always flares when you're starving for certainty. But the case stayed where it always stays, right at the edge of confirmation, because without excavation that finds something undeniable, the theory remains a theory, and the families remain stuck. And that's why this story hit so hard for a US audience, because it isn't exotic or distant. It's a normal neighborhood, a normal house, a normal night after graduation, and then a vanishing that doesn't behave like real life. If it was a planned abduction, the offender had to be confident enough to approach a lived-in home at night with 3 people inside and leave without creating noise that woke the neighborhood. If it was an unplanned encounter, then the offender got unbelievably lucky because unplanned crimes usually spill evidence, they create mistakes, they leave behind panic, and this house looks like the offender never lost control. So the question keeps coming back to the same 2 words, authority or trust, because both explain the quiet, both explain the unlocked door, and both explain why personal belongings stayed behind, but neither explains the missing ending, because the ending is what the case never gives. It never gives a confirmed sighting after that night. It never gives a confirmed location. It never gives the world a place to point to and say, here is what happened. It just gives you an address, a driveway, with 2 cars, a dog waiting, a broken porch-like globe that got swept away too soon, and a missing message that could have been the last voice in the story. And the longer you sit with that, the more you realize what makes this case terrifying. It's not the violence you can see, it's the violence you can't. It's the idea that 3 people can be removed from a home so cleanly that the house itself looks innocent, like it never witnessed anything at all. The first thing investigators had to do was accept that the house was not the scene of a fight, it was the scene of a removal, which means the most important moment likely happened at the front door, not in the living room. Because if someone forced their way in, you expect damage, shouting, neighbors waking up. But if someone was invited in or accepted at the threshold, then the danger can enter quietly and the house never has to look broken. So one of the strongest scenarios starts with a knock, late night or early morning. Someone speaks through the door, and the tone is urgent enough to make a mother step forward and polite enough to keep two teenagers from panicking. It could be something as simple as, "There's been an accident outside," or "Your car lights are on," or "We need you to answer a question." And once the door opens, the entire situation changes from home to compliance. Authority is the cleanest version of that, because authority doesn't need to be real to work. It just needs to look real for 30 seconds. A badge, a flashlight, a confident voice, a story that sounds official. And suddenly 3 people are standing together in a doorway, listening, not realizing they're being positioned. And then, if a weapon appears, it doesn't have to be fired. It only has to be shown once, because now the offender has what matters most: control. And control is how you move people without noise. Once people are moved from a living room to a hallway, from a hallway to a porch, from a porch to a vehicle, the crime stops being in the house and the evidence stops living in that address. That's why the purses and keys being left behind feels so important, because it suggests they didn't plan a trip. They were interrupted, or they were convinced it would be quick, just 1 minute, just step outside. There's also the trust version, and it's harder to talk about because it's uglier, but it fits the quiet too. If the person at the door was someone they recognized, a neighbor, a friend, a familiar face from town, then the door opens faster, the questions get answered faster, and the moment the situation turns violent, it's already too late to reverse. That's why this case keeps pulling people into that same thought. Whoever did this either looked safe or felt safe for at least a moment. Then you get to the first day mistakes, and none of these were evil mistakes. They were human mistakes, the kind that happen when people are scared and trying to help. The glass got swept, the doorknobs got touched, the rooms got walked through, the phone got answered, and every touch turned the scene from frozen in time into blurred by love. In a case where there isn't blood to test or a broken door to photograph, the case needs tiny things: a footprint, a fibre, a partial print on glass, a voice on tape, and tiny things don't survive crowds. That erased answering machine message is the most painful example, because even if it was nothing, it would have told investigators what nothing sounded like that morning. And if it was something, a threat, a disguised voice, a clue, then it was the only piece of the offender that might have been preserved naturally without anyone realizing they were preserving it. Some friends later described strange phone activity that morning, calls coming in, silence, hang-ups, the kind of thing you'd ignore on a normal day, but in hindsight it feels like someone testing the house or listening to who was inside. Even if those calls were unrelated, they still add to the atmosphere, because the first hours were chaotic, and chaos is exactly what an offender benefits from. Another early problem is that people searched outward before they searched inward, which makes sense emotionally. You don't want to believe abduction, you want to believe misunderstanding. So the first instinct is, maybe they went to breakfast, maybe they went to the lake, maybe they drove somewhere. And by the time the word kidnapping is even spoken, the missing hours are already gone. And those missing hours matter because whoever took them had a head start, and head starts in cases like this are everything. If the offender had a vehicle and if the women were moved quickly, then by sunrise they could have been far outside Springfield, and the house would already be useless as a location. That's why investigators often say, the home wasn't where you'd find the answer, it was only where you'd find the last normal moment. Over time, the case developed its repeating shapes: the fake authority theory, the someone they knew theory, and the opportunist theory, the person who happened to see 2 girls arrive late and decided to act. The opportunist theory is terrifying because it's simple, but it also requires luck, because removing 3 people without leaving obvious evidence is not easy if you're improvising. So, the longer this case stays unsolved, the more it pushes people towards someone practiced, someone comfortable with intimidation, someone who could keep 3 people compliant long enough to get them into a vehicle. Then you get to the suspects and claims, and this is where the case becomes a hall of mirrors. A famous case attracts false confessions, attention seekers, and people with messy histories who fit in the way a shadow fits a wall, close enough to scare you, not close enough to prove. Some names surfaced because of criminal history, some surfaced because of local rumors, and some surfaced because they said something later that sounded too specific to ignore. But without recoveries, those claims never become the kind of truth you can stand on. They remain heavy possibilities, and families end up living under the weight of possibilities instead of facts. The theories that keep resurfacing do so for one reason: they offer an ending, and the human brain craves endings. That's why the buried under concrete idea became so sticky, not because it's comfortable, but because it matches the fear of modern life, that you can build over the truth and live on top of it forever. It also fits the emotional vibe of this case. The women vanish, the city changes, time passes, and the answer feels like it might be sealed away where nobody can reach it without tearing something up. But there's another reason these theories persist. The lack of any confirmed trace after the abduction suggests the offender either killed quickly or hid extremely well, and both of those possibilities push people toward a disposal method that eliminates discovery. That's why no bodies doesn't just mean we don't know. It also means the offender may have succeeded in the one goal that matters most: preventing the case from ever becoming physical. Because once you have a body, you have a location, and once you have a location, you have a timeline, and once you have a timeline, you can start pinning lies to walls. Without it, the offender stays floating and the investigation stays stuck in the first hours. The door, the porch, the broken globe, the erased tape, and the empty driveway with cars that never moved again. The most haunting part is that the house wasn't trashed, it wasn't ransacked, it didn't look like a nightmare. It looked like a normal home that just stopped being inhabited. And that's why people still talk about this case in the same tone, because it doesn't feel like a crime scene. It feels like a pause button was hit and the people were deleted while their belongings stayed behind. If you try to build the tightest version of what could have happened, you have to start with what didn't happen. No broken door means the entry was likely quiet. No obvious struggle means any violence. If it happened, either happened after they were moved, or it happened in a way that prevented noise. And the fact that purses and keys were left behind suggests they didn't believe they were leaving for long, or they didn't get the chance to think about it. So the most believable step-by-step timeline looks like this. Suzie and Stacy arrive home in the early morning hours. They park, they go inside, they settle in, and the house shifts into that sleepy, half-awake state that happens after a late night. Shoes kicked off, lights low, the kind of moment where you're not thinking about danger. Sherrill is there, likely asleep or trying to sleep, and if she's awakened, it's not by screaming, it's by something small, a sound outside, a knock, a voice, the kind of interruption that makes an adult step into "what is this" mode. Now bring in the porch light globe. If the globe broke during the crime, it likely broke during a moment of movement, someone bumping it, someone pulling someone stepping wrong in a hurried exchange at the threshold. It's a small detail, but it's one of the only physical signs that something went off script. So imagine the door opens, and for a minute, everything is still normal in their minds. A man stands there, maybe alone, maybe with someone else, and he speaks confidently. In one version, he claims authority, security, police, we need you to come outside. And the key is that he speaks like someone who expects obedience. In the other version, he's familiar enough that Sherrill doesn't slam the door, or Suzie doesn't panic, and that familiarity buys him the seconds he needs. Then the tone changes, a weapon appears or a threat becomes clear, And in that instant, the entire crime becomes a control problem. Because he has 3 victims, but he doesn't want noise, he doesn't want neighbors, and he doesn't want to fight 3 people in a hallway. So he does what offenders who want silence often do. He keeps them moving. He makes them step outside. He makes them walk to a vehicle. He creates urgency so they don't think. He creates fear so they comply. And he keeps his voice low so nobody hears. This is why people focus so heavily on the idea of authority, because authority prevents screaming. If you believe the person at the door is allowed to give orders, you don't immediately shout, you ask questions, you hesitate, you try to cooperate. And cooperation is exactly what a predator needs for the first 30 seconds. Once the women are outside, the house is no longer important. Now the important place is the vehicle, and that vehicle could have been parked close enough to keep the transition quick, because the faster you move people from door to car, the less chance there is of a scream carrying across a neighborhood. If the offender had help, it becomes easier. One person controls, the other drives. If he was alone, it still can happen, but it requires more planning and more intimidation. Now the house stays quiet because the crime left it behind. The women are moved, and whatever happens next happens somewhere else, somewhere the offender chose. That's the part of the case that feels like a trap door, because the moment they leave that porch, the story enters a space where we have no witnesses, no cameras, no physical anchors, only guesses. Now let's talk about the erased clues, because the Springfield 3 case is also a story about how a case can be wounded in the first morning. The broken glass was cleaned up, people walked through rooms, objects were touched, and the answering machine message, possibly the only preserved voice connected to that morning, was erased. Even if that message was just a wrong number or a hang-up, it would have told police what kind of calls were coming in, it would have anchored a timeline, and it would have allowed investigators to compare voices if a suspect ever emerged. If the message was threatening or strange, then erasing it didn't just remove information, it removed direction, because in a case like this, direction is everything. When a crime scene is quiet, you need sound. When a scene has no struggle, you need voice. And that voice was lost. So investigators were forced to build the case on a few cold facts. Last known movements, cars in driveway, personal items left behind, no forced entry, broken porch globe, then nothing. And that is why tips and rumors became so powerful, because when facts are thin, the human brain tries to fatten them with stories. Over time, investigators received reported sightings, reported vehicles, reported screams, reported confessions. But unless a tip comes with a location, a physical trace, or a witness who can be confirmed, it becomes another branch on the same tree. And the tree grows, but it doesn't lead you out of the forest. What keeps this case so alive is that it feels solvable. It feels like there should have been a neighbor who saw headlights. It feels like someone should remember a suspicious car. It feels like someone in town should have noticed a man washing mud off his hands the next morning. But the world doesn't always give you that. Sometimes an offender gets lucky. Sometimes an offender plans well. Sometimes a neighborhood sleeps through the only minutes that mattered. And then you're left with the horror of it. 3 people can be taken from a home, and the home can still look like it's waiting for them to come back. That's why the Springfield 3 is not just a mystery, it's a fear. Because it suggests the most vulnerable place, your house, can become the starting point of a disappearance that never returns an ending. So when people ask what is the biggest unanswered question, there are really 2. Who got them to the door without triggering an alarm inside their minds? And what was on that answering machine? The voice that might have been the last thing the house ever tried to preserve. Because if that message mattered, then the case didn't just lose evidence, it lost its last sentence. And the story stays open because without that sentence, without bodies, without a confirmed location, the only thing that remains certain is the emptiness. 2 cars in a driveway, a dog waiting, and a house that never got its people back. Once police understood this wasn't a "they'll be back soon" situation, the entire morning shifted because now every minute mattered, and the problem was the most important minutes had already passed while friends were still hoping it was nothing. They started with the obvious phone records, last known movements, who saw the girls at the parties, who knew they were heading to Susie's house, and whether anyone had reason to be watching that driveway late at night. They also had to do something brutal. They had to treat the house like a starting point, not an ending, because a clean home with no struggle usually means the real crime happened somewhere else. That's when Springfield became its own kind of pressure cooker. Because the disappearance didn't happen on a highway or in the woods. It happened in a neighborhood, and everyone suddenly had the same question. How does a person pull that off without waking the street? Investigators tried to rebuild the night in reverse. They followed the graduation parties, the last stops, the routes, and the time window between the girls arriving home and the first concerned friend showing up in the morning. And every time they traced it, they hit the same wall. The last confirmed moment is they made it home, and everything after that is just silence. The phone became one of the strangest parts of the first day because friends were in the house, and the phone rang, and people answered, and the calls didn't behave like normal calls. Some were hang-ups, some were silence, and whether those calls were connected or not, they added to the feeling that the house was being tested, like someone wanted to know who was inside, who was looking, and how quickly people were realizing something was wrong. Then there's the answering machine mistake, because once that message was gone, the case lost the one thing it didn't have anywhere else, a preserved voice connected to the last hours. In a case with no forced entry and no struggle, voice can become evidence. Voice can be identity. Voice can be the difference between a theory and a direction. Without it, investigators were left staring at objects, purses left behind, cigarettes left behind, keys left behind, and the worst part, those objects say the same thing. They didn't plan to disappear. That's why the compliance theory sits at the center of so many explanations, because compliance explains the quiet. It explains the lack of damage. It explains why 3 people could be moved without a screaming fight. If you can make people believe they have to cooperate, even for 1 minute, you can move them out of safety before their brains catch up. And if you can move them out of the house, you remove the one thing that protects them: walls, light, neighbors, familiarity. You move them into your space where you control what happens next. So investigators began thinking less like, who broke in, and more like, who could make them open the door? Someone pretending to be police, someone claiming there was an emergency, someone saying there was a problem with the car, a neighbor's complaint, a threat, a lie that sounds official enough to keep voices low. Or someone they recognized, someone whose face made the door open faster. And that version is harder to accept because it means the danger wasn't random, it was close. The broken porch globe fits both versions because a small accident at the threshold makes sense in a fast, controlled moment. Someone turning quickly, someone being guided, someone bumping the light as they were moved. And because it got cleaned, it became symbolic. Not just broken glass, but a clue that existed for a moment, then was erased, like the case itself. The next stage of the investigation is where hope and frustration begin trading places, because tips pour in, and every tip feels like a lifeline. People call in vans, people call in suspicious men, people call in late-night noises, people call in a sighting at a store, and for families, every call feels like it might finally be the door opening back the other way, but for investigators, tips are a flood. And a flood can drown a case if you don't have solid evidence to anchor it. If you don't have a confirmed vehicle, a confirmed direction of travel, or a confirmed witness who saw them being taken, then the case becomes a map with no starting arrow. That's why certain theories keep resurfacing, not because they're guaranteed, but because they match the shape of the silence. A single offender with a gun and a confident voice working fast, moving them into a vehicle, leaving before daylight, that theory explains the quiet. 2 offenders, one controlling, one driving, that theory explains how 3 people could be managed without chaos, especially if the victims were kept separated and frightened. And then there's the most frightening possibility that the offender didn't need to force anything at all, that the door opened willingly, and by the time the threat was visible, the victims were already in the wrong position to fight back. As years passed, the case became haunted by names, and this is where the story gets messy, because famous cases collect claims the way beaches collect driftwood. Some people insert themselves for attention, some people repeat rumors until they sound like facts, and some offenders hint at knowledge because hinting gives them power, even if they're lying. So investigators had to treat every claim like a potential trap. They could not chase every story forever. They had to chase the ones that came with something real, a location, an object, a detail that wasn't public. One reason this case stays alive is because the public can feel the missing evidence. You can feel it in the way the story keeps pointing back to the first morning. If the message wasn't erased, if the glass wasn't swept, if fewer people walked through the rooms, maybe there would be a print, a footprint, a fiber, something small that would become huge later. But that's the cruel truth of missing person cases. The first hours are when the scene is most fragile, and in this one, the scene was handled by people who were trying to help. Over time, the Springfield 3 became less a single event and more a wound in the city because it happened to regular people in a regular house on a regular night. That's why it hits so hard. You can't comfort yourself with distance. It's not deep wilderness or offshore. It's a driveway, a porch light, a living room, a dog waiting. And because there's no confirmed end, the story never stops. It just loops every few years. Someone says they know something every few years. A rumor flares every few years. People hope the case will finally become physical. But physical means one thing. It means finding them, and that is what the case has never given. So the mystery remains exactly where it began. A house that looks paused, purses still inside, cars still outside, and a tiny, shattered globe that might have been the only honest sound the scene ever made. And when you strip the case down to what truly matters, it becomes 2 questions that refuse to soften with time. Who got them to the door without triggering the kind of panic that wakes a neighborhood? And what happened after they left the porch, in the minutes where the story stops being a mystery in a house and becomes a mystery on the road? As the hours turned into days, investigators had to make a hard call, treat it as an abduction with urgency, while also admitting they had no confirmed direction of travel, no confirmed vehicle, and no confirmed sighting after that night. That meant the case became dependent on people who noticed something, who heard something, who saw headlights at the wrong time, who saw a stranger parked too long, because without physical evidence, the first real break almost always comes from a human mistake. Springfield responded the way towns do when something impossible happens. Phone lines lit up, rumors formed instantly, and every rumor sounded plausible because the truth was still blank. But rumors are dangerous in a case like this because they create noise, and noise hides the one signal that matters, the single detail that is real and specific and verifiable. Investigators pulled everyone's timeline apart, the graduation parties, the last places Suzie and Stacy were seen, the route home, and the last confirmed window where they were alive inside that house. And every time they traced it, they returned to the same terrible conclusion: the crime most likely occurred after they arrived and before anyone outside realized the night had changed. That's why the porch area kept getting revisited in theory, because it is the only place where a fast, quiet removal could leave a physical hint, a bumped light, a dropped object, a rushed movement that doesn't turn into a full struggle. Even if the broken globe was accidental and unrelated, it sat in the story like a bruise, small, easy to dismiss, but hard to stop staring at. Then the investigation ran into the reality of human behavior. The first day wasn't handled like a crime scene because nobody wanted to believe a crime had happened. Friends moved through the house like family does, touching, checking, answering calls, searching for anything that looked off. And by the time the situation became official, the scene had lost its sharp edges, which meant detectives had to build the case on absence, what wasn't taken, what wasn't used, what wasn't packed, and what didn't make sense. Those purses became one of the loudest silent details because purses don't stay home when you leave for real. They stay home when you think you're stepping out for a minute or when someone steps you out before you can grab them. The same goes for keys. The same goes for cigarettes. The same goes for money. It's like 3 lives were paused mid-action and only the bodies were removed from the frame. As weeks passed, the case became famous, and fame brings attention, but it also brings predators, false leads, and people who enjoy inserting themselves into tragedy. So detectives had to treat every "I know what happened" like a potential trap. Because in high-profile disappearances, there are always voices that want to be part of the story. Over time, certain names became sticky, not because they were proven, but because they fit the kind of person people imagine could pull this off. Someone with criminal history, someone comfortable with control, someone who would not panic with 3 victims. One convicted offender later made claims that kept resurfacing, and claims like that hit families like lightning because they sound like certainty, and certainty is what the case has never provided, but a claim without a location, without a recovery, without a detail that only the offender could know can't close anything. It only reopens the wound and forces everyone to imagine the ending again. Then there's the kind of lead that becomes a legend inside a case, the rumor that the women are buried beneath a later concrete structure because it offers a reason why nothing has surfaced. The reason that theory sticks is simple. Concrete feels final. It feels like a lid slammed on the truth. And it matches the fear that an answer could be right there, hidden under ordinary life. Search technology and scans can suggest anomalies, but an anomaly is not a name, and an anomaly is not a body, so the case keeps hovering near resolution without touching it. And that hovering becomes its own kind of torture, because every few years the public hears new interest or new lead, and families have to lift their hope again, only for it to settle back into the same emptiness. If you step back, you can see why the Springfield 3 remains so unsettling. It's not a wilderness disappearance. It's not a road trip gone wrong. It's a home, a driveway, and a night that should have ended with sleep. It attacks the basic comfort people rely on, the idea that home is the safest place in the story, because in this case, home is where the story breaks. And if the offender used deception, the case becomes even colder, because deception means the victims were pulled into compliance, not by force at first, but by a lie that sounded reasonable for a few seconds. That's why so many people focus on fake authority, because fake authority is the fastest way to remove panic, and removing panic is how you keep neighbors asleep. But the trust possibility never disappears either, because trust explains why a door opens in the middle of the night, and why voices stay low, and why the home doesn't look like it resisted. Both theories share the same grim center. Whoever did this needed control, not just control of bodies, but control of sound, control of timing, control of the first 5 minutes. Because in a neighborhood, 5 minutes is the difference between a scream that wakes a street and a quiet departure that looks like nothing happened at all. That's what makes the missing hours feel so heavy. Those hours weren't filled with clues, they were filled with movement. And if the offender kept moving, the trail could have been scattered across miles before daylight. And once daylight comes, the world fills up again. Cars on roads, people waking, noise everywhere, and the disappearance gets buried under normal life before anyone even knows they should be looking. So the case becomes a locked room mystery without the room actually being locked, 3 people gone, everything they would need to leave behind, and a scene that never gives the satisfaction of a clear, this is what happened here. The brutal truth is that this case stalled for the same reason it became famous, because it happened clean. Most investigations get traction from mess, a broken door, blood, a weapon, a witness who heard screaming, a camera that catches a face, something that forces the story into one direction. The Springfield Three didn't give investigators that gift. It gave them a house that looked lived in, a driveway that looked normal, and 3 missing people, which means the case had to be solved from the outside in, not the inside out. And that is the hardest way to solve anything, because the outside world is infinite. Infinite roads, infinite vehicles, infinite strangers, and without a clear direction, every lead becomes a needle hunt. The first reason the case likely stalled is timing. The girls arrived late. The disappearance likely happened in a narrow, quiet window, and by the time friends realized something was wrong, the offender had already been given what every abductor wants most: hours. Those hours are a head start you can't undo, because once victims are moved away from the home, everything becomes harder. The offender can change vehicles, change routes, change clothing, and destroy evidence long before police know where to look. The second reason is contamination, not because friends were careless, but because they were human. And in those early minutes, humans do what humans do. They enter, they search, they touch, they clean up broken glass, they answer phones. If there was a fingerprint on a doorknob, a partial print in glass, a shoe mark on the porch, a fiber on the carpet, it may have been smeared, stepped over, swept up, or mixed into everyone else. In a case with almost no violence visible, the smallest evidence is the most valuable, and that smallest evidence is the easiest to erase. The third reason is the crime's shape. If this was an abduction, it was almost certainly built around compliance, and compliance doesn't leave loud signs. Compliance leaves silence. A weapon shown once, a confident command, a lie that sounds official. And suddenly 3 people are moving without shouting because they believe shouting will get someone hurt. And that silence is what makes this case feel unreal, because it means the neighborhood may have slept through the only minutes that mattered. Now, after decades, if this case ever breaks, it will likely break on one of a few things, not because the investigation stopped caring, but because time changes what is possible. 1, a confession that comes with proof, not just a story, but a location, an item, a detail that was never public. 2, physical discovery, remains, a burial site, a place that turns the case from missing into here. 3, a new forensic match from something preserved. Even if the early scene was contaminated, sometimes one item survives with enough integrity to speak later. And 4, the human factor. Someone who stayed quiet finally deciding they can't carry it anymore, because cases like this often sit behind one person's silence. That's why the suspect theories matter less than the mechanism, because the mechanism is what the evidence suggests: a controlled removal, fast, quiet, and designed to keep the house from becoming a crime scene. The house was treated like a place people slept. But that night, it was treated like a doorway. And in the Springfield Three, the doorway is everything, because whoever did this had to get them to open it, had to keep them from screaming, had to move them before daylight, had to disappear into a city that was still asleep, and then had to live with it. That last part is the one that keeps people staring at this case, because the offender didn't just take 3 people, the offender left behind a normal-looking house as a kind of insult, like proof that a person can commit something horrifying and still leave the world looking calm. A dog waiting, cars in the driveway, purses on the floor, lights off. No scene, no ending. And that's why the tiniest lost details hurt so much, because they feel like the house was trying to speak and got silenced. The porch light globe shattered, then got swept away. The answering machine held a message, then got erased. The first morning filled with footsteps, voices, touched surfaces, and then everyone realized too late the moment they needed to preserve was already gone. So the story ends where it began, with a home that looks paused, and 3 women who never came back to unpause it. Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall were teenagers who made it home after graduation night. Sherrill Levitt was a mother who was inside her own house. And sometime in the dark hours of June 7th, 1992, someone turned that house into an empty container and walked away with the people. No forced entry.
No confirmed witness, no final message, just silence. And the most haunting part of that silence is that it doesn't feel like an accident. It feels like a choice. Because whoever did this didn't just take them, they took the ending too.